Hello, welcome all. Today in this lecture, we will start to look at the novel form as it comes to India. We have already looked at Dean Mohammed's travels, which according to Vinay Dharwadkar is the first Indian writing in English in that sense. So now we move from there to look at the purported first novel in English written by an Indian, that will be Rajmohan's Wife by Bankim Chandra Chatterjee or Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay as he is known. But before going into the novel itself, I think it's instructive for us to look at the novel form as such. What were the contributing factors to the rise of the novel in the Western world, from where it comes as an export to India through colonial intervention. Now, we will have a brief introduction to Bankim Chandra Chatterjee and how he was deeply enmeshed in the colonial modernity project. But first, let's try to think about the Western novel as such, because I think it's important to just rehearse some of the foundational principles of novel in the Western world and see if those attributes, characteristics directly translate to India when the novel comes to India, or when we see the Indian English novel as such. So, we will begin with the rise of the novel by Ian Watt. I think many of you would be familiar with this text. It's one of the seminal texts in novel theory itself. Ian Watt's seminal study focuses on 18th century and how the novel form came to being through the works of Defoe, Richardson and others. So, what are his formulations and arguments? Those will be our focus in this lecture, and we will also see if there are other accounts of the rise of the novel which will then help us situate the Indian English novel. Ian Watt's influential study takes us back to 18th century to look at the origins of the novel, and according to Ian Watt, the novel is very different from the other forms of literary expression that were prevalent at this point of time, poetry, epic, drama itself. So, he tries to situate this entire discourse by outlining what were the contributing factors to the rise of such a distinct form of literary expression. And he informs us in these lines. Let's read these lines. The novel is the form of literature which most fully reflects this individualistic and innovating reorientation. We'll come back to this slide. What does he mean by this antecedent that he uses? As we read on, probably it will become clearer. Previous literary forms had reflected the general tendency of their cultures to make conformity to traditional practices the major test of truth. The plots of classical Renaissance epic, for example, were based on past history or fable, and the merits of the author's treatment were judged largely according to the view of literary decorum derived from the accepted models in the genre. So, he's telling us like how the conventional canonical genres at this point of time, like Renaissance and classical epics, were tested and also were apprised. He says this literary traditionalism was first and most fully challenged by the novel. He says, and this is what he goes on to elaborate as a thesis in his work, that novel comes to challenge many of the foundational perceptions, many of the foundational tenets of literary expression. What counts as the subject of literature to be treated, what counts as the experience to be thought of as real, or what counts as truth in that sense. He says these were challenged by the novel. As he outlines that from the till like novel comes to being, there is a certain kind of a rigidity, there is a certain kind of a stable order that is there in terms of interpreting, understanding literary text. But this traditionalism was first and most fully challenged by the novel, whose primary criterion was truth to individual experiences, which was always unique and therefore new. So, one of the first and foremost characteristics of a novel was the rise of individualism, as he will outline. And what he will tell us is that it is not only a literary movement, or it is not a literary transformation that we see that by 18th century suddenly we have literary expressions which are championing the individual. No, he says this is also augmented and also pushed by a philosophical and social movement that has been going on. The shift was fueled by the rise of Protestantism, which again in a certain way championed the individual. And here it might be important to think of the early modern period, or as we know it as the Renaissance, which again put the individual at the center of the universe. And we have writings by Marlowe, Shakespeare, Donne, who exemplify that shift. Renaissance humanism percepts tell us that the human is the storehouse of infinite potential, and thus we start seeing a gradual shift towards the individual itself. And obviously Protestantism takes the big leap here, where it breaks away from the way that religion was practiced at this point of time, and trying to think of religion in more personal terms rather than in terms of organized and institutionalized religion, if you remember how it pans out across Europe. Also, as we are talking about the social movement, we also need to think about the philosophical movement, and it will be amiss on my part if I don't recall Descartes' famous line, "I think, therefore I am," and you will see the I coming in a big way in terms of philosophical discourse itself. And Descartes is thought of as the father of modern philosophy, the seminal contributor to modern philosophy, from where we from 16th century and onwards. So we have contributing factors in the shape of philosophical discourses and social movements, which are pushing for preeminence of the individual itself. So therefore novel finds itself at the right place when these changes are taking place in various domains of the society. We see a kind of shift in not only in the history of ideas, but also in the real society itself. And therefore novel what asserts is thus the logical literary vehicle of a culture which in the last few centuries has set an unprecedented value on originality on the novel, and it is therefore well named. That we need to think about the individual. Every individual has unique stories to tell. Every individual's life is a unique narrative. So thereby, if we can tap into that, and which the novel does, it looks into the story of the individual itself. One of the things that and what mentions is that if you look at the novel form, it's very distinct from the earlier forms, because novel does not depend on the type, but rather than on a individual character itself. So it does not depend on types like the genres of epic or poetry or drama would emphasize on, as you would have read through classical drama or the Elizabethan drama itself. You have certain types that there is a comic figure, and the comic figure is of a certain kind. But here in novel, you start having very particular individuals who are represented. For example, if we take the one of the texts that Watt also thinks a lot about in this book, Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. Defoe presents Crusoe like it was not done before. What I mean by that is this emphasis on originality, this emphasis on individual experience. So we have Crusoe's painstaking accounts of how he lived on a marooned island, shipwrecked, and what did his life mean every day. So we have a very unique account in its detail that was not possible before, and there was a reading public that was ready to latch onto this idea of the individual. And that brings me to the second most important point that Watt highlights along with individualism. This is also 18th century is also the rise of the middle class. As we will remember, this is the age of industrialization, and Protestantism also, with its idea of Protestant work ethic, kind of fuels the rise of the middle class now. Of course, business, empire, trade have helped the rise of this class, and this class, unlike the aristocrats, unlike the gentry, does not derive its powers from its birth. It derives its power from its work ethic, derives from the money that it has accumulated, the property it has accumulated, and it has come up the rank. So we also look at an age where social mobility now becomes a phenomena. So we have two contributing factors here. One is the rise of individualism, that you start seeing these individuals, and many of them, these individuals, are probably not from the class that was depicted in the earlier forms like epic and drama. So there is an emergence of economic and economic activity. There is a emergence of an economic class called the middle class, and as we know, England is a very class ridden society, and here the rise of the middle class then demands expression, and that expression comes through the novel itself, because the novel, unlike other genres before, focused on individuals and ordinary individuals specifically, individuals like Robinson Crusoe. If one was to go back and read Crusoe's account, he would talk about the middle station in life, and he would say, I'm paraphrasing from memory, that how middle station in life is actually the best station in life, because you are not either very poor so that you are closer to destitution, or and desperate in life, or you are too rich, because being too rich is also brings its own problem. So therefore, Crusoe, as a voice of the new middle class, puts the middle class as the aspiration in that sense. So what we have then therefore we need to think and of the novel, the rise of the novel, as participating in these socio-cultural movement itself. The socio-philosophical movements like rise of individualism, rise of Protestantism, and then the emergence of the middle class itself. Therefore, the novel is ripe for to come into being in the 18th century is what Watt tells us in his work. Then Watt tells us of a certain function of the novel, a salient feature of the novel, which is known as formal realism. He argues and he coins the term formal realism. He says, so if the contributing factors to novel were individualism and rise of the middle class, then the feature of the novel is also very important. He says that novel, because it is representing the ordinary life, and because it does it in a certain way, that's why the novel becomes a very powerful genre, and a genre which is quite successful, which is in even continuing its run today itself, right? So he says it's because of something called formal realism, because he says novel embodies a circumstantial view of life that may be called formal realism. He thinks of it more as a kind of a mode of the novel. He says formal because the term realism does not here refer to any specific literary doctrine or purpose, but only to a set of narrative procedures that are so commonly found together in novel. So he says that this is a narrative strategy. What is the narrative strategy? He says by formal realism I mean these three things. He says particularization, which means that a novel depicts very particular stories that and he starts from simple things like the name itself. The name Robinson Crusoe is a very unique name and name of a person. So you know that, oh, I probably also may know someone like Robinson Crusoe. Or as you would see, the names that novels keep of their protagonists. None of these names are something that will make you feel alien. You will probably have an idea that, okay, this person I may live next doors to me, or lives in some other country, or lives in some other geographical locale, but this is a person who lives, particular person who lives. So it's about creating that convincing illusion or reality, whatever you want to call it, but it is a story of a particular person in a specific location with very specific attributes that the person can have. So you know the person so well that you actually think that you have met them. If you were to meet a character from the novel you have read and you have loved, you will probably know a lot about that person. So, so that is the first criteria. The second one that he talks about is again the focus on ordinary. So, we have first particular identity that is there. So the stories are of people like us in that sense, that novel offers that kind of a worldview. The second is the focus on ordinary. So rather than grand or epic events in that sense, we are told about ordinary lives. We are told about ordinary things, that ordinary can be represented. What epic or classical drama thought was not possible or not desirable even, novel overturns that. That's why the genre itself is called novel, because it brings in very new things. It challenges very orthodox perceptions about what could be represented. So, as a democratic, in a sense, novel brings in that democratic principle to literary works of art, that you can focus on the ordinary itself, that the ordinary can be represented. Again, let's go back to the idea of Robinson Crusoe or Gulliver's Travels or Tom Jones. You have very ordinary things being represented. Or if you look at like the entire history of novel henceforth, you look at novel's interest in small little details. For example, a detail of the furniture in the room, or even events that would have been thought of as inconsequential by earlier forms. Earlier forms would have not probably paid attention to that idea. I am reminded here of, let's say, Marcel Proust's classic work, In Search of Lost Time, where the ordinary event of tasting a cookie, taking a bite of a cookie, becomes such an extraordinary event. That's what he means by the focus on the ordinary, among other things. Like it can mean also focus on ordinary people, focus on everyday experiences. Many everyday experiences come to being described. Even the everyday experience of getting bored also gets described. Robinson Crusoe also talks about how he doesn't have anything to do on this marooned island for many days, and he then starts reading the Bible, and then he finds some kind of a spiritual company and some kind of an epiphany of sorts. So, you can see that the focus is on these very ordinary, everyday, mundane things and people. The third thing that it offers as a related offshoot of this is psychological depth. So, what we have also as a very different thing, and this will be taken forward by the 19th century and the 20th century writers to very different degrees. What 18th century starts at, offering the psychological depth, what we call as interiority of the character itself. So you have characters who you know so deeply, so well, as I said, that you will probably recognize them, and you will probably know, if you were to meet them, you don't need to talk to them, you would have known that what this character is thinking, because the author has provided you with such depth into their minds. Something that comes to my mind as an example is Meursault from Albert Camus' Outsider. If you look at that book, it's a very unconventional character whose mother has died, and he receives this letter, and then we get a peek into his world itself, that the world is very different for Meursault, who after his mother has died does not know how to process his grief, or processes it very differently from what would be a normal way. goes to movie, meets an attractive person, and like goes on with his life and does things that would not sit together with what would be a conventional way of life, and that's why it creates an uproar. We get to know depths about these kinds of characters, or a character like Lemuel Gulliver, who travels to different parts of the world, and it's not just a superficial exploration that, oh, he's going from here to there, and we see that he's deeply introspective of his station in life. What is the meaning of life? What is the truth of life? What is the meaning of society? Questions like this, which also come to someone like Robinson Crusoe. That what do I do? Who am I? Where am I? And what do I do? Again, being shipwrecked in the Maroon Island, he thinks of that. Take a look at Jane Austen, George Eliot, Thomas Hardy, Lawrence, Joyce, Woolf, any of these big names from the British canon itself, you will see that they offer a kind of psychological depth that was not offered in drama or in epic or in poetry to that extent. They might have offered it, but then it's in bursts. It's not so much as a novel would provide. And any of you who are interested to further know about this can read something by Eric Orbach called Mimesis, which this book talks about this journey from the earliest of epics till Virginia Woolf in that sense. So which again tallies with this scheme outlined by and what. So now the questions that come from Ian Watt's influential study are some like this: that was it such a linear journey that all of a sudden 18th century provides this ground to have the novel spring up from nowhere, right? So there are other theorists of novel, one of them being Michael McKean, whose book Origin of the Novel offers a corrective to and a much broader survey to Ian Watt, because McKean begins his survey from 1600s to the late 18th century. McKean argues that unlike what Watt thinks that it's directly the rise of individualism and the rise of rise of the middle class that contributes to the rise of novel, McKean would offer us a dialectical account of the novel itself. He says it's not a settled discourse. So unlike Watt's rise of the novel, which basically means that from here it starts, 18th century it starts, he says novel is actually not a settled genre at this point of time. He says novel is characterized by generic instability. Why? Because he says that there are two questions, and then these are ideological questions that he thinks are very important to the novel at this point of time, to the emergence of the novel. He says one is the questions of truth and the other is the questions of virtue. What does he mean by this? That there is a shift in terms of how we know about the world that we can see from 16th century onwards, as we were talking about in terms of early modern period till 18th century to 18th century. So how do I know the truth? Previously, if there was some kind of what he calls is the romance idealism, he says now it's moved to naive empiricism, and the novel emerges out of a negotiation of these two competing schemes. And for him, novel is as much participant in epic, poetry, drama, etc., as much as it is participant with the form of the romance itself. So therefore, he talks about the idea of romance idealism, which means the world is an ideal or an allegorical reflection of universal truths. And we see this in many of the narratives itself, that the world is an allegory. So it's kind of an ideal truth of universal, and it's a reflection of universal truths. One has to parse through it. Whereas naive empiricism talks about the world as we can know through sensory and direct experiences. So if romance idealism is talking about interpreting, naive empiricism is talking about knowing it directly through empiricist, through sensory details. So you have competing claims of truth that are being made by 18th century, and that starts from 16th century is what McKean says. Similarly, about virtue, there is a crisis because we have the aristocratic sense of virtue that is now being questioned by the progressive, as he says. So the progressive ideology, which does not think that the station of life or the truths about life or the questions of virtue are to be decided based on birth itself, whereas the aristocratic virtue signals that. And these two also come in tension. So you can see this, for example, in Pamela itself, right? Richardson's Pamela, where the questions of virtue, questions of truth are negotiated through these four rubrics in that way. What McKean offers us through this kind of a longer history is novels' participation in multiple genres, novels' participation in multiple discourses, then probably a slightly more linear account in Iron What. And this is important for us because when it comes to India, we have to ask questions like, okay, the novel comes through all this. In the West, it is a byproduct of industrialization. It's related to the emergence of the middle class. It's also a byproduct of individualism. And then questions of like truth, questions of virtue, all this is known to the students of novel in the West. But when it comes to India, we don't have these contributing factors. We don't have a replica of this happening in India. Industrialization is in its infancy, and there is hardly a middle class to talk about, and individualism is not what we think in terms of the Western world. So how does then novel emerge in India? And then the more important question will be, if this is not if these are not the contributing factors to the emergence of the novel in India, and these are not the proximate genres like romance, epic, and poetry and drama, as it is seen in the Western avatar, then what is the contributing factor in its Indian version? The Indian English novel, how does it participate with and differ from the vernacular novels actually? So those are questions that we need to also think about. Thank you.